Neat place, Andrich commented, maybe an hour later, where the entire group stood high up on one of the suspended walkways. One that was technically a couple of sizes too large for the humans, Miat, and Terravelt involved, and looked down at what was to be the venue for the event they had been so graciously invited to. The grounds of the Fairbing Taxa Hotel were, for the most part, vast and open, as the building stretched out to what James assumed had to be at the very least a square mile in total area, although there was a good chance he was vastly underestimating it. Entrances could be found in many a place on the rather blank metal walls, meaning you could generally come or go no matter what direction or angle you approached from, including above, as even the roof showed multiple outcropping openings that looked a whole lot more inviting than emergency accesses. Just like all the other entrances, each of them was decked out with a large, fancy glass door that incorporated similar technology to the one the rest of the station was using, meaning you could see yourself approach them in a reflection made of tiny dots of light. Additionally, the ground was painted in a deep violet, sort of invoking a red carpet feeling, although James was unsure if it had the same intention behind it. Through the glass doors or some opened entrances, warm yellow light flooded out of the building. Too bad easily defendable looks pretty different. Next to him, Admir rubbed at the back of his hair before moving his hand to press against the side of his breath filter. Well, at the very least we won't have to worry about escape routes, he mumbled, likely also already planning for any possible occurrences that could come up during their stay in his mind. They'd have to surround the entire building. Not impossible to do, Coco chimed in, although her tone was less serious than that of the others. Still, what she said was clearly true. Yeah, but that would be like a major bitch to keep under wraps, Admir defended his earlier point with a shrug. While we need to plan for everything, I suggest a reasonable step one would be to walk through it a couple of times, and note down exactly which routes we should take in which order, for at the very least every quadrant of the premises, but ideally even tighter knit than that. Sounds reasonable to me, Andrich announced, before turning his head to the rest of the team. Any objections? No, sir. A general echo came back to him, which then led him to wave everyone along so they could keep walking and make their final approach onto the building. As he started following along as well, James suddenly felt a tug on his arm. Turning his head, he saw that Neo was leaning into him. Quite unlike all the other humans around, his sister still seemed to feel relatively awkward about constantly wearing the breath filter over her face, as she was far less used to it than everyone else. Constantly, she reached for it or moved her head slightly uncomfortable from the unfamiliar feeling of being cooped up in the shell. Hey, you don't actually think that this place is going to be attacked, do you? She tried to ask him quietly. However, the volume amplification of the device was apparently something she hadn't quite taken into account yet, and therefore her words were more than audible to everyone in the group. Tuya, who was walking right next to her, reassuringly reached for her hand. Meanwhile, James could do little but shrug his shoulders in mild concern. I don't necessarily expect it, but it's far from impossible, he said, as much to his sister as to himself. Better be prepared and don't need it, than need it and not be prepared. He thought back to their last conflicts on space stations, especially the one he had faced nearly alone. It had certainly been a major league disaster, especially with the way he had handled himself as the stress had overtaken him. This time, he would very much like to not wake up with a missing limb after terrifying an entire galaxy inadvertently. For a moment, he turned his head further to look back towards Konglorch, who was leisurely trudging along a couple of measures behind him. Back then, the Lissitor had been at his side, almost without asking any questions on the matter. It was the oddest thing. James had never really questioned that, ever since it happened. However, They were both still here, so there was a good chance that the giant reptile had his reasons. Nia pulled her head back in worry, but seemingly couldn't think of much else to say on the matter. Instead, she looked down at the venue again as they gradually approached it. Like her girlfriend had done before him, James also reached for her other hand and gave it a tight squeeze. "Hey, we're going to be fine," he assured her, while looking directly at her covered face. "This is a diplomatic outing, and if someone wants to mess around, we'll be ready for it. If they really want to take on an entire team of armed humans, we'll show them why that's a very bad idea." They had not come here to play, and their equipment reflected that. As a group with the galaxy's eyes on them, they were going to expect every eventuality. Nia looked back at him and nodded, though it concerned him slightly that he had no idea if her face underneath the mask was matching the gesture. Inhaling deeply to say something else, he was suddenly stopped as Sheeta put a hand onto his shoulder and shushed him. Confusedly, he turned to look at her. However, as he saw that her eyes were closed and ears were scanning the room, he shut up and allowed her to listen. Her hearing was enormously better than his, after all, and that was even further amplified by the fact that her ears weren't covered, unlike those of her human colleagues. After a few long seconds of listening, the feline then finally spoke up in a quiet voice. "I think," she started, before her left ear twitched strongly and turned into a slightly different angle. "Yeah, I think someone is calling for you." The entire party halted for a moment after her words, all of them straining their ears to listen. "You're right," James could hear more comment from behind him, and Conglorch too nodded his massive head. Curie froze near completely for a second, before turning their body to face slightly upwards at a sideways angle, seemingly also following their ears. However, James had to admit he didn't hear anything. He wasn't quite sure if that was because of the breath filter, or because his ears were simply maladapted to this atmosphere, which they were, but either way, he found himself awkwardly reminded of his time back on the GES, when he was often the last to hear something when a faint sound came up. At least his fellow humans didn't seem to be faring a whole lot better than he was. However, what they lacked in hearing, they certainly made up for in eyesight, and therefore they could easily follow the gazes of their fellows with their eyes. And once they knew the direction the presumed sound was coming from, it didn't take long until they had found its source without even hearing it themselves yet. A small figure was running full speed across one of the nearby walkways for smaller people that were situated slightly above their own, going so fast that they had lowered down to use all their appendages in their movement, except for one arm which they had raised so eagerly to wave at the group, seemingly trying to wave them down. At this distance, they were barely more than a moving speck to most, but for the humans, they were close enough to notice that that was a small primate approaching them there, although with their long face, they looked to be a lot more lemur-like than most others. Completely unlike anything on Earth, their fur was a flashy pink and mottled with white circles that surrounded single grass-green dots. To human eyes, the combination looked quite sickly, although that experience was quite obviously not universal. Using their short hind legs, and 3 of their 4 long arms to great effect, they ran along at a still rather meagre speed, their velocity seemingly vastly hindered by their size alone. A long, clearly prehensile tail was stretched out straight behind them, a dark pattern of wavy purple stripes running across it. A few seconds after spotting them, the humans could then finally also hear the apparent calls. "Ambassador Aldwin! Ambassador Aldwin!" they yelled 2 more times, before seemingly realizing that the group had stopped and was looking up at them, which caused them to severely slow their hasty steps while they yelled, "Thank the tops you finally heard me! You're the party from Earth with Ambassador Aldwin, correct?" Glancing over to his guards, James got little more than shrugs as an answer, as whoever this small person was really didn't appear to be much of a threat. Not quite in the mood to yell his head off himself, James simply lifted his hands as a sign back, that would be us. Switching to using just 2 instead of 3 of their arms for walking, the strange primates then also lifted their hands.
Let's meet at the next convergence of the walkways,
they suggested, with heavy movements, seemingly rather out of breath on their sprint. Although he didn't quite have any reason to do anything that person told him to, James was admittedly intrigued. And after finding no major protest to the idea while glancing around, he simply shrugged and gave back the sign for OK, before the group continued on their way. Only about a minute later, they had already arrived at one of the many places where large, long ramps were connecting the different walkways to suspended platforms that were then in turn connected to the ground level of the station and used for getting on and off these walkways. Looking around, they quickly found that their strange new acquaintance was still a good way off, and would probably need a bit longer until they also arrived. "Look at 'em go," Ahmed commented, as they watched the pink primate struggle between keeping a steady pace to not make them all wait for them for too long, while clearly also not wanting to break into another sprint. "Do you recognize the species?" Curie's artificial voice asked, as they stepped up to James from the side, interestedly eyeing this new person that would approach a group of predators, cyborgs and Deathworlders so boldly. James briefly rifled through his memory cards in his mind. "Pixameria, I think," he noted, after a moment of thinking, now seeing the card clearly before him. Smallest sapient primate in the galaxy, and the second smallest species overall. Their territory is on the fringes of a core world, but also borders with the death world, Lorchaherdi. In the community, they're mostly, well, they're pretty average folks, just kind of doing their own thing. Curie nodded before turning their body back to the approaching person. They sure were taking a while. Must be annoying to have such short legs. Maybe a bit more than a minute later, they finally also arrived at the platform, and they once again waved to the group as they descended the last ramp separating them. Admittedly, James wasn't quite used to having to really look down at people when they talked anymore, and so he felt a bit awkward about cranking his head down, as the person stopped maybe a step away from him, still rather out of breath.
"Oh, tops,"
they mumbled to themselves.
"Quite the pace you have for your size."
Seeing as the person quite obviously had no weapons on them, and figuring that any physical altercation would likely end less than stellar for them, none of James's guards bothered with blocking him in any way, as he came forth to be the first to approach the strange being, while everyone else simply stared at them with gazes reaching from suspicious to bemused. "We don't usually have to wait for anyone," James then informed, after letting the primate catch their breath for a moment longer. "Since you seem to know me, may I know who I have the pleasure with?" The primate's face seemed to light up as they gazed up at him, the rather plushy ears at the side of their head fluttering excitedly.
"Of course. My name is Lossarana Emjor. I am the son of Lossaranajar Emjor, the invited representative of the Pixmeria for the Council of Primates," he exclaimed with a bow of his head, but a jovial tone. She also owns part of the hotel over there. You know, the one where the conference will take place in, I'm sure you know. I've, been somewhat involved in the planning of everything."
"He looks like a plushie I lost when I was 5. James could hear Tuya's voice quietly whisper to Nia behind him, in English, so there was of course no chance of her being overheard, of course. Nia let out an amused breath through her nose, right before smacking against her girlfriend's shoulder with the back of her hand disapprovingly.
"You are probably on your way to the hotel grounds, correct?"
Lossarana then continued after his introduction, and pointed in the hotel's direction with one of his arms. while his intensely purple eyes stared up at James.
If you want, I can show you around a bit and help you with checking in and Wait, do you not have any luggage? I was told humans always came with an abundance of cases for all the gear they carry with them.
James blinked a couple of times at the very quick words that were thrown at him there, taking a moment to sort them out in his mind. One thing that stood out was, this person seemed to know quite doubtlessly that they hadn't checked into the hotel yet, meaning either they or someone else was quite possibly keeping a specific eye on that fact. Not necessarily concerning yet, but definitely something to take note of. He also couldn't help but shake the feeling of how awfully convenient it was to run into someone like this right as they were on their way to inspect the premises. Thank you, but that really isn't... James wanted to decline. However, he was quickly stopped by yet another hand on his shoulder. If it's no trouble, we'll gladly take a little tour, Admir said, in an enthusiastic voice that also carried a certain authoritative tone with it that was likely supposed to tell James not to push against his suggestion. Feeling that the man likely had a plan, James decided to close his mouth and go along with it.
Splendid!
Losserano exclaimed as he started to crawl in the direction of the ramp leading down to the ground level, where the easiest entrance to the hotel grounds would be.
Just follow me, and if you have any questions, do not be afraid to ask away.
Everyone immediately got ready to follow, however. It quickly became rather awkward, as the entire group had to severely slow their steps, so they wouldn't immediately overtake their guide on accident. While the Pixameria weren't the entirely smallest species in the galaxy, James was certain that they were already pushing the limit of how small a sapient creature could get, especially if head and brain size was considered. And their size certainly didn't do their speed any favours. Moving in a way that made him almost feel like he was stepping on the spot, James slowly moved along with them for a few steps, as Admir approached him from the side. If we know where they want to lead us, we will possibly know what places to avoid in case of emergency, he informed James, to explain why he had interrupted him earlier. I think we should value knowing what they want us to think. Nodding at the explanation, and seeing some logic behind that, given that they were already here to scout everything out, he accepted that it had been the right call to simply let Admir do his thing. Meanwhile, while it felt pretty awkward for most of them to try and follow at such a slow pace, Sheida was by far the worst off, and James felt like he could see her blood pressure rising as she stared at the primate's back with burning eyes. Even her tail started to agitatedly sway through the air. Feeling quite bad for seeing her like this, and also wanting to avoid wasting a lot of unnecessary time, James briefly quickened his pace and walked up right next to the leading man. He knew that in some circles, what he was about to do next would be seen as a not insubstantial insult. However, even at the risk of coming across as incredibly rude, James felt like it was worth trying his luck here, for everyone's sake. Excuse me, Losserana? He got the lemur's attention as he walked up next to him, his large strides easily overtaking the man, as purple eyes looked up at James. I know it could be seen as quite patronizing to ask this, but considering the way we still have left to go, would you maybe mind if one of us carried you, just to speed things up? The Pixameria stopped on the spot, and turned to look at the group that was slowly walking after him, briefly scanning across everyone before looking back up at James. And in a gesture that James really had not expected, the green spots on the lemur's fur, as well as part of his purple eyes, not just metaphorically, but quite literally lit up. In a rare display of sapient bioluminescence, light spread out across the lemur's body, and his eyes sparkled up at James.
You would do that?
He asked, in a tone that spoke of awe but also slight disbelief for the offer being real, and apparently he took the one of us statement as James specifically offering to carry him around. Not that James minded doing it himself, of course. For a split second, James wondered if he should be concerned about the man's seeming enthusiasm at being carried. However, he couldn't find a specific reason to do so. "Sure," he said with a shrug, before crouching down and offering his arm to his fellow primate. Although carrying him around already was the kind of awkward thing to do for many, just scooping him up from the ground like a house cat would have felt a step too far. And indeed, the presented arm was more than enough for Losarana, as the lemur quickly and nimbly grabbed onto the sleeve of the offered appendage, and easily pulled himself up onto James's shoulder. While James then began to stand up again, the smaller primate shifted a bit on his shoulder, trying to get into a secure position by placing his feet flatly down in a deep crouch, while stabilizing with his forearms reaching in all directions to support his stance. And, inadvertently, in a gesture that seemed completely natural to the smaller man, one of the small hands also reached to take a tight hold of the hair on the back of James's head that stuck out of the breath filter. Which was something James couldn't quite accept. "Mind grabbing something else than my hair?" he therefore asked in a restrained tone. It wasn't like the mild pull of the small hand hurt all too much, but the gesture itself was definitely uncomfortable. Losarana seemed confused for a moment as he looked at James's face. However, then a switch in his brain seemed to flip as he quickly let go, and instead held onto the back of James's collar.
"Oh, excuse me,"
he quickly apologized with a deep bow on James's shoulder, while his bushy tail started to wrap around the upper part of James's bicep.
"Most other primates don't mind, so I just assumed... I'm sorry. I should have clarified it first."
"It's fine," James replied, now almost feeling bad that the man felt like he needed to apologize so rigorously for a simple misunderstanding. No harm done. With James now taking the lead while the Pixameria guided the group from his shoulder, the speed of the group picked up quite a bit again. The glow of Losarana's fur didn't quite subside yet, as it seemed like he was, in a way, quite happy about being carried around like this. And as there wasn't a whole lot of guiding to be done yet, as they merely approached the hotel, he seemed quite content with sitting there and trying to make some small talk, whenever the opportunity arose. Soon enough, Sheeta walked up to James, after having fallen back a bit at first. Now coming face to face with the feline on what was basically eye level, James could feel Losarana's hold on his shoulder and arm tighten a bit, and he felt a certain tenseness in the primate's body that told of a readiness to possibly leap away from the predator, should it become necessary. The man probably didn't actually think that he would need to flee from Sheeta, at least not intellectually. However, for many off-worlders, some instincts were a hard thing to shake. It was almost somewhat surprising that there hadn't been a similar reaction to the humans themselves. However, with their breath filters on, there was a good possibility that they didn't quite register as predators to the man, meaning that whatever part of his brain told him they were primates likely took precedence. "So, Mummy owns a hotel on a Deathworlder station, huh?" Sheeta started to question the man, clearly noticing his tension, but not quite planning to do anything about that, as her yellow eyes fixated the Pixameria. "How did it come to that?" Before he answered, Losarana crouched down even deeper, seeming to find a certain comfort in the larger ape allowing him to rest on his shoulders, even if the association to Sheeta was in reality much closer than it was between the two of them.
"How,
he replied, his voice unsure, and filled with a certain level of subconscious fear.
Well, it was a business venture that popped up when she had recently parted with an old business partner of hers that had bought out her half of the hotel they previously ran together. The money wasn't enough to open a completely new one on her own, and since she had just recently had me, she didn't want to get into a lot of debt to make it happen. But she had a good reputation, so she was contacted about possibly becoming a partial owner of a new hotel on a very new station. However, it was a Deathworlder station, but in her words, she had little to lose and a lot to gain.
Sheeta's ears flicked as she listened to that, and James was unsure what exactly she wanted to learn from this conversation. Businesswoman, huh? She mumbled after a smack of her teeth. I can respect that. However, in the meantime, James noticed something in the explanation. She had just had Losserana when this station was freshly built. This station was new, sure, but it wasn't that new. Odd question, but may I ask how old you are, Losserana? James therefore inquired, while mildly tilting his head to talk to the person on his shoulder.
In uniform years? Slightly older than 4,
the lemur quickly informed him, even if sounding slightly confused as to why James was asking the question. Of course, the guy riding on his shoulder and speaking like a teenager was more than twice his age. James probably shouldn't have expected anything else at this point. Not too long after, they all together strode into the hotel, directed by Losserana, which entrance to take to arrive right in the large lobby.
Bring me to the counter over there,
Losserana ordered, happily, while pointing at what looked to be a currently unmanned workstation of the hotel service personnel.
Your accommodations are already booked, so I'll have you checked in no time.
As he followed the command, James glanced around. First at his surrounding company, who all looked just as bemused as he was, by the fact that they were now checking into pre-booked accommodations they had absolutely no intention of ever using. And then at the fancy, very fancy in fact, surroundings. Knowing the comparative cheapness of the rooms they had booked on their own, James admittedly felt kind of bad at the sheer amount of money that was most likely wasted on empty rooms they would never enter here. There was certainly a bit of a difference between the Rushgat Hive and the Fairbank Taxi Hotel when it came to the atmosphere of it all. The high ceilings of this place reminded James of the buildings of the Zoditos in ridiculousness. Much like the restaurant he remembered from being invited to it on the GCS, even if he had admittedly forgotten the name. Every bit of metal that made up the building's walls was entirely hidden on the inside, be it by light wood paneling, colourful carpets, intricate tapestries, or flowing maroon curtains. The violet painted ground for the entrances also continued on the inside, although in here it was replaced by a fuzzy carpet of the same colour. Along some of the walls, vines, lianas, and other climbing plants had been allowed to grow along them in a clearly deliberate manner, giving the room some life with their different shades of bluish greens. Some of them even bore some bright white flowers. Of course, the lobby was also stacked on all sides, with comfortable seating opportunities for people of all shapes and sizes, most of which came in the form of large, padded cots or couches, although a few chairs did manage to worm their way in there. And of course, right now, most of them were in some way occupied by every single species that found itself in the revered order of the primates. James counted 7 different species of primates in this room alone, although admittedly humans and Pixameria were included in that count, especially since there were a lot more of Losserana's people around now. Although many of the primates, of course, didn't look all too alike between the species, it was immediately noticeable that everything still seemed to be a bit more samey than it was at the Deathworld conference. However, what was also noticeable was that this entire place was a lot more put together than they had been over there. Banners and garlands and other decorations for the conference were already hung up all around. Informative screens were placed along some of the walls, playing short clips of primate representatives speaking on repeat, while inviting you to step closer to interact with them. While cables and wires could be seen, they were neatly bundled together and stored out of the way behind fabric covers. And even ignoring that, this entire place was absolutely spotless. Clearly, this wasn't the first time this hotel hosted a large conference, and it most likely wouldn't be the last. When James finally reached the counter, Losserana quickly hopped onto it from his shoulder and moved to activate the attached computer terminal. James couldn't help but glance over to the quite long line of people that had formed in front of the actually occupied counter, dozens of people seemingly waiting for their arrival to be processed. And now he got special treatment over here, even though he didn't even really want to check in. Sometimes life really wasn't fair.
Alright, all done,
Lossarana said, after just a few seconds of work, making James think that he literally just had to change the status of their party from not arrived to arrived in the systems.
Would you like me to show you to your rooms?
James shook his head and raised a hand in decline. That can wait, he said in a casual tone. We'd much rather look around a bit for now. Familiarise us with the hotel a bit so we don't get lost when we wander around by ourselves. Could we maybe see where exactly the conference is going to be held? Enthusiastically nodding, Lossarana wasted no time with jumping back at James's arm and scampering back up onto his shoulder.
Absolutely. Just follow my lead.
And so they did. As they walked, James wasn't sure if Lossarana was entirely oblivious to the many quite venomous glances that were thrown their way, especially at Shida, Curie and James himself, or if he was just extremely skilled at ignoring them. Either way, at least outwardly, he was apparently entirely unbothered and happily chatted away, while his fur kept up its soft glow. Luckily, while a certain disdain towards the party of Deathworlders was clearly making itself known in the surrounding people's expressions and behaviours, the very reason for said disdain also ensured that nobody was actually going to bother them, as actively angering them was apparently quickly identified as a very bad idea by most of their fellow attendees. And as they slowly explored the premises, everyone took care to truly familiarise themselves with their surroundings. The hotel truly had entrances all over the place, meaning potential danger could quite literally come from anywhere, but could just as well be escaped in any direction. Additionally, it was seemingly built as the exact opposite to a labyrinth, as halls connected basically everything in an almost grid-like pattern. The conference itself would apparently be held in a large central room that luckily was a bit easier to overview than the rest of the premises, as it had one main entrance and exit way, as well as 4 separate emergency exits, which however seemed to be only openable from the inside upon inspection. Although there was a possibility that that could be overwritten, or the doors could be opened remotely somehow. Seating in the room was arranged in a large 2-level circle, with everyone's places predetermined beforehand. Since their group had a quite unique makeup of shapes and sizes for such an event, it would have been easy enough to find their own seats even if they hadn't had Lossarana with them, as a guide to point them in the right direction. Their seats were on the upper level of the circle, and they were placed close to a room's corner in a way that quite obviously allowed the organisers to leave the most possible space in between their seats and those of the people next to them. Whether this was for their own benefit or for that of the people seated nearby was unclear. However, James had a pretty good idea of what was the case. "Not too close to the stairs," Andrich mumbled quietly in English, as he stood in front of their seats and glanced over at the walkways that would lead up to this second level of seating. "But at least we can see the entire room. Maybe we should prop one of those emergency exits open beforehand, with one of us keeping a watch on it, just in case."
At least it's good that I can't make out any places a sniper or something similar could hide,
Athena noticed, as she scanned across the walls slowly. And James knew that she was thinking about where she would position herself if she wanted to kill somebody here unnoticed.
"If we're attacked in here, at least it will probably have to be head-on."
Admir scratched his neck as he also glanced around. "Walls look thick enough that shooting through them probably isn't going to happen," he informed, while glancing down at where large, expensive-looking camera equipment was already installed. "We probably won't have to worry about appearing on the feed, though one of us should watch it constantly to make sure nothing is happening underneath us."
"You think they'll let us check for explosives before everything starts?"
Tuyur asked, already looking closely under every seat and behind every wall panel for any hidden devices or bombs.
We'll do it whether they like it or not,
Coco, who was helping her, commented, as she checked the most vital spots of the area for any tampering.
I don't care about holding up proceedings a bit when lives might be on the line. If they have a problem with that, they are free to kick us out while the galaxy watches.
James could hear heavy swallowing right next to his ear, as he briefly leaned over the rails that separated him from the steep drop right in front of him, wondering if a drop from this height and this gravity would be dangerous.
Sure sounds serious what you're talking about there,
Losserana commented in the galactic uniform language, seemingly going off of everyone's tone alone.
Is everything alright?
That's just how our language sounds, James lied in a jokey manner, and chuckled to himself as if he found it exceedingly amusing. Everyone always says when humans talk it sounds like we're fighting. Losserana returned a courtesy chuckle.
Yeah, your language sure is wordy,
he replied. Then James turned around and cranked his head up. Any concerns on your part? He asked Moore, who had learned the human language together with Sheeda, seeing as she was kind of nervously looking around at the many seats. The old lady snapped up from her thoughts and quickly shook her head. I believe you all have a better grasp on what is necessary for our security, she said with a nod, and briefly combed through the fur on her neck with her claws. I was just thinking about how this is rather exciting. I mean, I know the reason for us being here is not a pretty one, but nonetheless, getting to take part in such an event, and with the Order of Primates nonetheless. James exhaled with a laugh. There were apparently some things that he just didn't understand. Turning to his sister, he continued his questioning, not wishing for anyone's concerns to not be heard, just because they didn't have a rank. What about you? I'm, trying not to freak out, Nia admitted with a chuckle, before letting out a long sigh. And I have no idea how you all stay so cool about this. All practice at this point, Sheeda commented to that, while putting a hand onto Nia's shoulder. Don't worry, we're all here to make sure no one gets harmed. Nia nodded carefully, but there still seemed to be some underlying anxiety in her movements, which James completely understood. She had not nearly been at this as long as everyone else, after all. As he watched her, Sheeda could suddenly feel Losserana tense up on his shoulder, and wondering what brought that on, he turned around, only to see Curie approach him. Unlike with Sheeda, where he had just gotten vaguely afraid, the Pixameria seemingly tried to physically avoid proximity to Curie by climbing onto James's other shoulder, seemingly not realizing that, in the process, he was climbing right onto a limb that was just as cybernetic as Curie's body was. Something the matter? James asked Curie, paying no mind to the ignorantly afraid man on his shoulder. Curie tilted their body for a moment, looking out at the many assorted seats all around. I'm not sure if I am the right person to attend an event like this, the cyborg then admitted, after a moment of looking around. As always, their rigid face and eyes gave nothing away about their state of mind. James let out a breath through his teeth and crossed his arms. Well, that makes two of us, he admitted, and also looked around again. So many chairs, cameras on them, and a galaxy that hated their existence. Two cyborgs in a place that most likely none had ever entered. Glancing back at Curie with a soft gaze, James added, I wouldn't hold it against you if you didn't join for the actual conference if you don't want to. I will attend, Curie stated matter-of-factly, without a moment's hesitation. Splitting up was unwise the last time, and also, I wouldn't want to face this alone. I don't think you should, either. Reaching one of their backwards legs out to the great terror of Losserana, they pressed his tip against James's mechanical arm. An arm they had made for him. An arm that he was now ready to proudly present to the galaxy, no matter what anyone said. The corner of his mouth lifting into a smirk, James nodded. Thank you, Curie, he replied firmly, turning back to the cameras that would broadcast them to the entire galaxy during the event. There's no one I'd rather have at my side.
Of course. My name is Losarana Emjur. I am the son of Losaranaja Empure.
Fuck's sake. Oh, come on!